"You can't come in anymore, Evelyn," my daughter-in-law said through the crack of my own front door 3 weeks after my husband was buried. I stood frozen on the porch with my overnight bag hanging from my shoulder, certain I had heard her wrong. The October wind moved through the maple trees lining our street, carrying dry leaves across the driveway Tom had paved with his own hands 30 years ago. I looked down at the brass key in my hand and tried it again, slower this time. The lock didn't budge. My heart began to pound so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Vanessa," I said softly, still trying to understand what was happening. The key must be jammed. The porch light flickered above me. Inside the house, I heard the television playing somewhere in the living room. Familiar sounds. My home. But nothing felt familiar anymore. Vanessa opened the door another inch, just enough for me to see her face. Perfect makeup. Cream sweater. Gold earrings I had given her 2 Christmases ago. She didn't look angry. That would have been easier to understand. She looked calm. Almost bored. "The locks were changed yesterday," she said. "Ryan thought it was necessary." For a second, the world around me seemed to go silent. No wind. No cars. No rustling leaves. Just those words sitting between us like ice water. I stared past her shoulder into the hallway where family photos still lined the walls. The framed picture from our 40th anniversary was gone. The table beneath it was empty too. Why would Ryan change the locks? I asked. My voice sounded small, older than I remembered. Vanessa crossed her arms. "Because this situation isn't working anymore." I blinked at her. Situation. As if my marriage, my grief, my entire life inside that house had become some inconvenient arrangement they needed to fix. For days earlier, I had left to visit my sister Helen in Columbus because everyone kept telling me I needed rest after Tom's funeral. I hadn't wanted to go. Every part of me wanted to stay close to the house Tom and I built together. But Vanessa had touched my arm gently in the kitchen that morning and said, "You should take a few days away, Evelyn. Clear your head." Ryan had stood beside the refrigerator, staring into his coffee cup instead of looking at me. Now I understood why. I tightened my grip on the handle of my bag. "I live here," I whispered. Vanessa gave me a thin smile that never reached her eyes. "You lived here with Tom." The words hit harder than I expected. Tom, my husband of 42 years. The man whose reading glasses were still sitting beside his recliner when I left. The man whose flannel jacket still hung behind the laundry room door because I couldn't bring myself to move it. 3 weeks ago, I had stood beside his grave while rain soaked through my black coat, listening to people tell me how strong I was. Strong. I almost laugh thinking about it now. Strong women still break when the people they love decide they no longer belong. "Where's Ryan?" I asked. Vanessa glanced over her shoulder before answering. "He's upstairs." Upstairs. While I stood outside like a stranger asking permission to enter her own home. I looked through the narrow opening in the doorway again and noticed something else missing. The antique lamp from the entry table. The small ceramic bowl where Tom always tossed his car keys. Tiny absences. Tiny warnings I should have noticed sooner. "I want to speak to my son." Vanessa hesitated just long enough to tell me everything I needed to know. Then footsteps sounded on the staircase. Ryan appeared wearing gray sweatpants and the old college sweatshirt I bought him 20 years ago. His face looked pale, tired, but not surprised to see me standing there. That hurt most of all. He already knew. "Mom," he said quietly. He didn't move closer, didn't open the door wider, didn't hug me after 4 days away. "What is this?" I asked. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck the same way he used to when he got nervous as a teenager. "We think it's better if you stay with Aunt Helen for a while." I stared at him, waiting for the rest. Waiting for him to smile awkwardly and admit this had all been some misunderstanding caused by grief and exhaustion. But no explanation came. Behind him, I could see into the dining room. My dining room. Only now the curtains were different. Vanessa's curtains. White linen. Instead of the dark green ones Tom loved. She had already started changing the house. "Your father hasn't even been gone a month," I said. Ryan lowered his eyes. Vanessa answered for him. "Life moves on, Evelyn. Life moves on." I looked down then and noticed 2 cardboard boxes sitting just inside the hallway floor. One had my handwriting on the side. Winter sweaters. Suddenly my chest tightened so sharply I had to steady myself against the porch railing. They had packed my things while I was gone. Quietly. Methodically. Like I was already dead too. And through the glass panel beside the front door, I saw the rest of my belongings stacked neatly inside the garage. I do not remember walking back to my car that night. Later, I would remember small things in fragments. The sound of a dog barking somewhere down the street. The cold metal of my car door under my trembling hand. The porch light turning off behind me while my son still stood inside the house pretending not to watch me leave. But the drive itself felt like a blur of headlights and tears I refused to let fall. I sat in the grocery store parking lot 3 miles away because I could not think of anywhere else to go. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. My overnight bag rested in the passenger seat beside me. For days earlier, I had packed it myself in our bedroom while Tom's side of the closet still smelled faintly like cedar and aftershave. I had folded my sweaters carefully because I planned to come home. That was the part one could not stop thinking about. I had expected to come home. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. For one foolish second, I thought Ryan might finally call to explain everything. Instead, it was Helen. "Did you make it back safely?" she asked the moment I answered. I looked through the windshield at the glowing supermarket sign across the empty parking lot. "No," I said quietly. There was a long silence on the line. "What happened?" My throat tightened so badly I could barely speak. "They changed the locks." Helen inhaled sharply. I could picture her standing in her kitchen gripping the phone with both hands. The same kitchen where we had sat drinking tea 2 nights earlier while she told me I needed to stop worrying about everyone else and start taking care of myself. "Come back here," she said immediately. "Evelyn, do not sit out there alone." I closed my eyes. I was 70 miles from Columbus, nearly an hour and a half away. Under normal circumstances, it would not have mattered. But nothing felt normal anymore. Even my own body felt unfamiliar, heavy with exhaustion and grief. "I am tired, Helen," I whispered. "I know." Her voice softened. "But you are not alone." I wanted to believe her. I truly did. But loneliness has a strange way of settling into a house long before people realize it is there. Looking back now, I think the loneliness started the morning after Tom died. The funeral home flowers still covered the dining room table. Half-eaten casseroles filled the refrigerator because neighbors kept bringing food nobody touched. Every room carried the silence of interrupted routines. Tom's coffee mug remained beside the sink for 3 days before Vanessa finally moved it into the dishwasher without asking me. I remember standing there watching her rinse it out while sunlight came through the kitchen window. Such a small thing, but something about it hurt more than it should have. "We need to start moving forward," she said gently when she noticed me staring. Moving forward. Everyone kept saying those words after the funeral as though grief were some destination you reached by simply continuing to walk. Ryan changed too after his father passed. Not immediately. At first he hugged me constantly, asked if I had eaten, offered to handle paperwork and insurance calls. But after the memorial service, something shifted inside him. He became distant in ways that were difficult to explain. He stopped sitting with me in the evenings. He no longer lingered over coffee at the kitchen table the way he used to with Tom. Sometimes I would walk into a room and conversations between him and Vanessa would stop abruptly. Once, late at night, I came downstairs for water and heard Vanessa whispering sharply in the living room. "She cannot stay here forever." The floor creaked beneath me before I could hear Ryan's answer. Another time, I noticed the framed family photo from our beach trip missing from the hallway wall. Vanessa told me she was reorganizing. Then there were smaller things. Strange things. My bedroom door standing open after I distinctly remembered closing it. Boxes appearing in the garage. The lock on Tom's office desk suddenly changed. Every detail by itself seemed harmless enough. Grief makes people second-guess themselves. I kept telling myself I was imagining tension where none existed. But deep down, something cold had already begun settling in my chest. The afternoon Helen called inviting me to stay with her for a few days. I almost refused. I was sitting alone in the den wrapped in Tom's old navy cardigan while rain tapped softly against the windows. Vanessa entered carrying folded laundry and smiled when she heard me speaking to Helen on the phone. "You should go," she said after I hung up. "It might help to get away from all this sadness for a little while." She sounded so kind, so concerned. Ryan stood near the staircase listening silently. I remember looking at him then, waiting for him to say something. Anything. But he only nodded once and said, "Aunt Helen will take good care of you, Mom." I understand now that they had already made their decision before I ever packed my bag. I just had not realized I was being gently escorted out of my own life. Helen opened the front door before I even reached the porch. I had not realized how late it was until I saw the clock above her stove glowing almost midnight green through the kitchen window. The moment she saw my face, her expression crumpled. She pulled me into her arms without saying a word, and for the first time since Tom's funeral, I nearly let myself fall apart. Nearly. But some strange instinct inside me kept holding everything together by a thread. Maybe it was pride. Maybe survival. Or maybe after losing your husband, your home, and your son all in the same month, your heart simply becomes too exhausted to break properly anymore. Helen helped me carry my overnight bag inside, while rain began tapping softly against the porch roof. Her house smelled like cinnamon candles and chicken soup. Warm, safe, ordinary. I stood in her entryway, for several seconds staring at the family photos along the wall, because I suddenly could not remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. "Sit down," Helen whispered gently. "I will make tea." I lowered myself into one of her kitchen chairs while she moved quietly around the stove. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence between sisters is different from every other silence in the world. It does not demand explanations. It simply waits beside your pain until you are ready to touch it. Finally, Helen placed a mug in front of me and sat across the table. "Tell me exactly what happened." I wrapped both hands around the tea just to stop them from shaking. Then I told her everything. The changed locks. The boxes in the hallway. Vanessa standing there in my doorway speaking to me like I was some unwelcome visitor. Ryan refusing to meet my eyes. Helen listened without interrupting once. But as I spoke, I watched her face slowly harden in a way I had not seen since we were young women. "That house belongs to you," she said firmly when I finished. I stared down into my tea. Apparently, they disagree. "No, Evelyn. Legally." I looked up at her then. Helen leaned forward, lowering her voice carefully even though we were alone. "Tom told Richard about the paperwork before he passed." Richard was Helen's husband, a retired accountant who spent 30 years handling estate planning for small businesses around Columbus. Suddenly, my chest tightened again. "What paperwork?" Helen frowned slightly. "The trust." I blinked at her. "What trust?" For a moment, neither of us moved. Rain continued falling softly outside. Somewhere upstairs, the pipes creaked as the furnace turned on. Then Helen sat back slowly in her chair, confusion replacing anger. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "Tom never told you." I shook my head. Helen exchanged a glance toward the hallway, as if considering whether she should continue. "A few months before his heart attack, Tom asked Richard for the name of an estate attorney. He said he wanted to make sure everything would be protected properly." My stomach twisted uneasily. Tom had always handled financial matters himself. Not because he did not trust me, but because that was simply the rhythm of our marriage. He paid bills every Sunday morning at the kitchen table while drinking black coffee and listening to old jazz records. I handled everything else. 42 years together creates habits that feel permanent until suddenly they are not. Protected from what? I asked quietly. Helen hesitated. "From Vanessa." I stared at her in disbelief. Tom said Ryan had changed since the wedding. He was worried Vanessa pushed too hard about money. About the house. A memory surfaced instantly. Last spring, Vanessa is standing in the backyard during our Memorial Day barbecue, laughing as she looked around the patio Tom built himself. "This property must be worth a fortune now," she had said casually while sipping white wine. Tom smiled politely, but later that night, he stood at the kitchen sink longer than usual staring out into the dark yard. When I asked what was wrong, he only said, "Some people look at a home and see memories. Others only see square footage." At the time, I thought he was talking about the housing market. Now I understood differently. Richard did not know details, Helen continued softly. Only that Tom wanted to guarantee you would always have a place to live no matter what happened after he was gone. My throat tightened painfully. Tom knew. Somehow, somewhere deep inside himself, he had already seen this coming. Suddenly, I remembered another moment from 2 weeks before he died. We had been sitting on the porch watching a summer storm roll through the neighborhood. Tom reached over and squeezed my hand out of nowhere. "Promise me something," he said quietly. "If people ever disappoint you after I am gone, do not mistake that for your worth." I laughed back then and told him he was being dramatic. Tom only smiled sadly and looked out at the rain. Sitting in Helen's kitchen now, I realized that had not been sadness on his face. It had been fear. Not fear of dying. Fear of what might happen to me afterward. Helen reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. You need to call an attorney first thing tomorrow morning. I nodded slowly, though my mind still felt numb from exhaustion and disbelief. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the neighborhood. I looked down at my wedding ring catching the kitchen light, and for the first time since Tom's funeral, grief gave way to something colder, something steadier, because suddenly I no longer felt like a helpless widow locked out in the rain. I felt like someone my husband had tried desperately to protect. I barely slept that night. Helen made up the guest room with fresh sheets and placed an extra blanket at the foot of the bed because she still remembered I always got cold after midnight. Small acts of care suddenly felt enormous to me. I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly in the dark while every memory from the last few months replayed itself differently inside my mind. It was strange how betrayal changed old conversations. Words that once sounded harmless suddenly carried sharp edges you never noticed before. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and walked quietly downstairs. The house was silent except for the refrigerator humming softly in the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window looking out at Helen's backyard. Rain still clung to the grass beneath the porch light. Everything looked still, peaceful. Nothing inside me felt peaceful anymore. For weeks after Tom died, I had blamed grief for the strange heaviness hanging over the house. I thought maybe everyone was simply coping differently. Ryan withdrew into silence. Vanessa became overly cheerful in a way that felt rehearsed. I kept telling myself families stumble after loss. But standing there in Helen's kitchen, I finally allowed myself to see the truth clearly. This had not started after the funeral. It had started long before Tom died. Suddenly memories began arranging themselves differently in my mind, like puzzle pieces finally locking into place. Last Christmas, Vanessa insisted we host dinner at our house instead of hers because she claimed our dining room felt more elegant. At the time I thought she was trying to include us. Now I remembered how she spent the entire evening asking Tom questions about the property taxes, the mortgage, the value of homes in our neighborhood. People would pay over $1 million for a place like this now, she said while running her fingers along the marble countertop Tom installed after his retirement bonus. Tom answered politely, but afterward he seemed unusually quiet while loading the dishwasher. Another memory surfaced. 2 months before his heart attack, Tom came home from lunch looking irritated. When I asked what happened, he hesitated before finally saying Ryan and Vanessa wanted him to help finance a business investment. I told them no, he said firmly while loosening his tie in the hallway. Some people need to learn the difference between ambition and entitlement. I remember defending them immediately. I told him young couples struggled financially. I told him Vanessa only wanted stability. Tom listened patiently before saying something that unsettled me even then. Ryan used to worry about building a life. Now he worries about inheriting one. At the time I accused him of being unfair. Looking back now, I think he was trying to warn me without destroying my relationship with our son. Around 7 the next morning, I heard Helen moving around downstairs. The smell of coffee drifted through the hallway. When I entered the kitchen, Richard was already sitting at the table reading, glasses low on his nose while reviewing papers from a leather folder. He looked up gently when he saw me. "Morning, Evelyn." His voice carried the calm steadiness of someone used to handling difficult conversations. Helen placed a mug beside me before sitting down. Nobody rushed into speaking. That alone made me trust them more. Finally, Richard folded his hands together carefully. "I made a few calls early this morning." My stomach tightened immediately, and he slid a business card across the table toward me. Tom worked with an estate attorney named Daniel Mercer downtown. Very reputable. I spoke briefly with his office assistant. I stared at the card without touching it. Daniel Mercer. The name meant nothing to me. Yet somehow this stranger knew more about my husband's final wishes than I did. Richard continued carefully. "The assistant could not discuss details over the phone obviously, but she confirmed there is active trust documentation connected to your property." Property. Such a cold word for the place where Tom taught Ryan to ride a bicycle in the driveway. The place where I painted nursery walls before becoming a mother. The place where every birthday candle, every Christmas morning, every ordinary Tuesday dinner of our married life had unfolded quietly over 4 decades. "So the house is protected?" I asked softly. Richard nodded slowly. "Potentially very protected." Helen reached for my hand under the table. "Which means Vanessa and Ryan may have made a serious mistake." I looked down into my untouched coffee. Even now, hearing Ryan's name beside words like mistake and legal issue made my chest ache. No matter what he had done, he was still my son. I remembered him at 6 years old running through sprinklers in our backyard while Tom grilled hamburgers on summer evenings. I remembered helping him practice multiplication tables at the kitchen counter. I remembered the exact sound of his laugh as a teenager when Tom accidentally dropped an entire birthday cake onto the patio once. Love does not disappear simply because betrayal enters the room. That is what makes family heartbreak so cruel. You mourn people who are still standing right in front of you. Richard opened the folder slowly. There is something else you should know. His tone changed just enough to make me straighten in my chair. Yesterday afternoon, after Helen called me, I drove past your neighborhood. I frowned slightly. Why? Richard hesitated. Because I wanted to see whether your belongings were really still in the garage. The room suddenly felt colder. And Richard removed his glasses carefully. They were not in the garage anymore. My heartbeat quickened instantly. What do you mean? He looked directly at me then. Evelyn, your furniture was loaded into a moving truck. For several seconds, nobody at the table spoke. I could hear the clock above Helen's stove ticking softly while my mind struggled to absorb what Richard had just said. A moving truck. My furniture. My belongings. Not packed neatly into storage while emotions cooled down. Removed. Transported. Erased. I set my coffee cup down carefully because my hands had started trembling again. Did you see where they were taking it? I asked quietly. Richard shook his head. No company name on the truck. Just two men loading boxes and furniture through the garage. Helen's face tightened with anger. They were trying to empty that house before Evelyn could come back. I stared at the table in silence. Suddenly, images began flashing through my mind one after another. Tom's leather recliner being dragged across hardwood floors. The cedar chest my father built before he died. The blue china cabinet I spent months restoring after Ryan was born. 42 years of marriage reduced to items someone else decided no longer belonged there. The strange thing about deep betrayal is that it does not always arrive as rage. Sometimes it arrives as exhaustion. A heaviness so complete you can barely move beneath it. I need to see the house, I whispered finally. Helen opened her mouth immediately. Absolutely not. Helen. No, Evelyn. Not alone. Richard nodded in agreement. If Vanessa is already removing property, we need to handle this carefully. Carefully. Everyone around me spoke calmly now. Legally. Strategically. But inside my chest, something raw and wounded kept asking the same question over and over. How did my own son allow this to happen? Around noon, Richard drove me back toward my neighborhood. The closer we got, the quieter I became. Familiar streets passed slowly outside the passenger window. The diner where Tom and I ate breakfast every Saturday morning after retirement. The pharmacy where he used to tease me for buying too many greeting cards. The little park where Ryan learned to throw a baseball. Every ordinary landmark suddenly felt haunted by the version of my life that no longer existed. Richard parked half a block away from the house. Let me walk up first, he said gently. But I was already opening the car door. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold pavement after last night's rain. I moved slowly down the sidewalk toward the house Tom built for our family 30 years earlier. From a distance, everything looked normal. The porch swing still hung beside the front steps. The maple tree in the yard still blazed orange and red with October leaves. But as I stepped into the driveway, my stomach dropped. The curtains in the living room were completely different now. White linen. Vanessa's style. The flower pots I kept by the front porch were gone too. Replaced by tall modern planters I had never seen before. It was astonishing how quickly someone could transform a home once they stopped caring who it belonged to. Then I noticed the garage door standing partially open. My breath caught. Empty. Completely empty. No boxes. No furniture. Nothing. The space where Tom kept his workbench looked strangely bare without his tools hanging neatly against the wall. I stood frozen, staring into the emptiness while a sharp ache spread through my chest. Richard stepped beside me quietly. Evelyn. Before I could answer, the front door opened. Vanessa stepped outside wearing cream-colored leggings and carrying a ceramic coffee mug like she belonged there completely. She stopped the moment she saw me. For one brief second, surprise flashed across her face. Then it disappeared behind that same calm expression she always wore. You should not be here, she said evenly. I looked at her carefully. Not angry. Not hysterical. Just cold. That somehow hurt worse. Where are my things? I asked. Vanessa took a sip of coffee before answering. They are being stored. Stored where? Somewhere safe. Richard stepped forward slightly. Mrs. Carter has every legal right to know where her property is located. Vanessa's eyes shifted toward him dismissively. And you are? Family. She gave a short smile. Then perhaps you should help her understand that clinging to the past is unhealthy. I felt something inside me go completely still. Not broken. Still. Because suddenly I saw her clearly for the first time. Vanessa did not believe she was doing something cruel. She believed she was correcting an inconvenience, removing an obstacle standing between her and the life she wanted. That realization chilled me more than shouting ever could. I want to speak to my son, I said. Vanessa leaned casually against the doorway. Ryan is busy. Busy. My own son too busy to face his widowed mother after locking her out of her home. Richard's voice hardened slightly beside me. You should know we are already reviewing the property documentation. For the first time, Vanessa's expression flickered. Barely noticeable, but I saw it. What documentation? She asked carefully. Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he removed a business card from his coat pocket and held it toward her. Daniel Mercer's office would like Ryan to contact them this afternoon. Vanessa stared at the card without taking it. The silence stretched several seconds too long. Then, from somewhere inside the house, I heard footsteps moving quickly toward the hallway. Ryan appeared behind her, looking pale the moment he saw me standing there beside Richard. But it was not guilt I noticed first on my son's face. It was fear. Ryan stepped onto the porch slowly, closing the front door behind him as though he was afraid the neighbors might overhear what came next. He looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hair was uncombed in a way that reminded me painfully of the little boy who used to stumble downstairs half asleep on Saturday mornings asking for pancakes. But the man standing in front of me now was not that little boy anymore. He was someone who had watched his mother get locked out of her own home and allowed it to happen. Mom, he said quietly. I waited for him to apologize. I waited for him to explain that everything had gotten out of control somehow. Instead, he glanced nervously toward Vanessa before speaking again. Maybe we should talk privately. Richard folded his arms beside me. Anything you need to say can be said here. Vanessa's expression tightened slightly. Ryan rubbed both hands over his face before finally looking at me directly. We thought this would be easier. Easier. The words settled heavily between us. I looked past him toward the front windows of the house where sunlight reflected against glass I had cleaned every spring for nearly 3 decades. Easier for who? I asked softly. Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Vanessa answered instead. Evelyn, nobody is trying to hurt you. I almost laughed hearing that. There is something surreal about being deeply wounded by people who insist they are helping you while they do it. You removed my belongings from my house, I said calmly. You changed the locks while I was gone. Vanessa lifted one shoulder slightly. You needed a fresh start somewhere calmer. That house carries too much grief now. Grief. She spoke about my marriage like it was outdated furniture cluttering up a room she wanted redesigned. Richard stepped forward half a pace. Actually, Mrs. Carter legally retains residency rights until trust administration is reviewed. Ryan's face drained of color immediately. Vanessa turned toward him sharply. What trust administration? She asked. Ryan stared at the ground. He did not answer quickly enough. That silence told me more than words could have. Slowly, very slowly, I turned toward my son. You knew? I whispered. Ryan's jaw tightened. Dad mentioned something before he died. The ache in my chest deepened instantly. Tom had trusted him with this. Even at the end of his life, Tom still believed our son would protect me. What exactly did he tell you? I asked. Ryan hesitated again before speaking quietly. He said the house was secured differently now. Richard nodded once. Which means ownership likely transferred into protected trust status before Thomas passed away. Vanessa looked between all of us in confusion that was rapidly turning into alarm. Wait. Ryan told me the house automatically became his after probate. Nobody spoke. Vanessa stared at Ryan. That is what you said. Ryan finally looked up, and for the first time since Tom's funeral, I saw genuine panic in his eyes. That is what I thought, he muttered weakly. Richard's expression hardened. You thought wrong. The autumn wind moved sharply through the driveway, scattering leaves around our feet. Somewhere down the street, a lawn mower started humming faintly. Ordinary sounds continuing while my entire family cracked apart on the front porch. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. This is ridiculous. We already spoke to someone about listing the property. Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly. You attempted to list a property you do not legally own. Ryan turned toward her immediately. Vanessa. But it was too late. The silence afterward felt enormous. Even Vanessa seemed to realize what she had just admitted. Richard pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and calmly wrote something down. Watching him do that changed the atmosphere instantly. Until now, this had felt like cruel family drama. Suddenly, it felt serious. Legal. Real. Vanessa's confidence began slipping for the first time. Nobody said anything about legal trouble, she said carefully. Richard closed the notebook. Then perhaps nobody should have removed a widow from her protected residence while relocating her property without authorization. Ryan looked physically sick now. He stepped toward me slowly. Mom, I swear I did not think this would happen like this. I stared at him quietly. Then how did you think it would happen? He had no answer. Because there was no answer that could make any of this acceptable. Vanessa suddenly interrupted sharply. Ryan, stop acting like we did something terrible. We were trying to move forward with our lives. I looked at her then. Really looked at her. Beneath the expensive clothes and controlled voice, I finally saw desperation creeping through the cracks. Not guilt. Fear. Fear that the future she imagined inside this house might disappear. Richard handed Ryan Daniel Mercer's business card again. This time Ryan took it with trembling fingers. Mr. Mercer expects your call before 5 o'clock, Richard said evenly. I strongly suggest you make it. Ryan stared down at the card silently. Then something caught my attention through the open front doorway behind him. The hallway table beside the stairs. Empty now except for one framed photograph leaning against the wall waiting to be hung. My wedding photo. Tom smiling beside me on a summer afternoon 42 years ago. Vanessa had removed it from the hallway but had not thrown it away yet. I do not know why that hurt me most. Maybe because it proved they were not simply erasing furniture. They were trying to erase history itself. I stepped backward slowly toward the driveway. Come on, Richard, I said quietly. Ryan looked up immediately. Mom, wait. But I was already turning away. Because suddenly I understood something important. They expected me to beg for my place in that house. They expected tears, anger, desperation. Instead, for the first time since Tom died, I felt strangely calm. And as I walked back toward Richard's car beneath the falling October leaves, I realized something else too. Tom had seen all of this coming long before I ever did. The meeting with Daniel Mercer took place the following morning in a quiet brick office building downtown. I remember staring at the elevator numbers as they climbed slowly toward the 7th floor, while my reflection looked back at me from the polished metal doors. In less than a month, I had gone from being a wife planning retirement trips with her husband to a widow sitting in an estate attorney's office trying to understand why her own son had removed her from her home. Grief changes your life quickly. Betrayal changes it even faster. Daniel Mercer greeted us personally in the reception area. He was somewhere in his late 50s with silver hair and the calm voice of a man who had spent years watching families unravel over money. The moment he shook my hand, his expression softened slightly. Mrs. Carter, he said gently. Thomas spoke about you often. Hearing Tom's name spoken aloud in that office nearly broke something inside me again. Daniel led us into a conference room overlooking the city. Rain clouds hung low over Columbus that morning, turning the windows gray. Richard sat beside me while Helen quietly poured water into paper cups from a tray against the wall. Nobody rushed into conversation. Finally, Daniel opened a thick folder in front of him. I reviewed the trust documents this morning, he said carefully. And I need to make something very clear immediately. The house belongs entirely to you. The room went completely silent. Even though I had hoped to hear those words, actually hearing them still felt unreal. Daniel continued calmly. 6 months before his passing, Thomas established an irrevocable living trust transferring sole residential rights and controlling ownership directly to you. I stared at him in confusion. What does that mean? Exactly. Daniel folded his hands together. It means your son does not own the property. He never did. And unless you personally decide otherwise, he will not. A strange mix of relief and heartbreak washed through me all at once. Tom had protected me. Even while dying, he had still been trying to shield me from this exact moment. Daniel slid several papers gently across the table. Thomas included additional clauses specifically preventing forced relocation, unauthorized property removal, or pressure related to sale of the home during your lifetime. Richard exhaled quietly beside me. Helen closed her eyes briefly in disbelief. But I could barely focus on the legal language in front of me because one thought kept echoing painfully through my mind. Tom knew. Somehow my husband had already understood what our son might become once he was gone. There is more, Daniel said carefully. My stomach tightened again. Yesterday evening, Ryan contacted my office after receiving my card. I looked up immediately. What did he say? Daniel hesitated slightly before answering. He appeared genuinely unaware of the trust details. I frowned. Vanessa said they planned to list the house. Daniel nodded, which creates a serious problem legally speaking. He removed another document from the folder, especially because movers were already contracted. Richard leaned forward sharply. You confirmed that? Daniel nodded once. Yes. The moving company provided copies of authorization forms this morning after I contacted them. My chest tightened painfully. Somewhere out there strangers had carried away pieces of my life because my son signed paperwork allowing them to. Daniel continued carefully. Mrs. Carter, under Ohio law, removing property from a protected residence without authorization may expose both Ryan and Vanessa to significant civil liability. Liability. Such a cold word for heartbreak. I looked down at my wedding ring twisting slightly against my finger. Tom used to rotate it playfully whenever we held hands during long car rides. Small memories arrived at strange moments after loss. Daniel's voice softened. I know this is emotionally difficult, but right now the priority is securing your home and recovering your belongings. Home. For the first time since being locked out, the word no longer sounded distant. It sounded possible again. Daniel handed me another sheet of paper. I have already filed an emergency notice preventing any sale activity connected to the property until further review. Richard smiled faintly for the first time all week. Good. Daniel nodded. Additionally, the locksmith records confirm the locks were changed 48 hours after Mrs. Carter temporarily left the residence. Helen shook her head slowly in disbelief. They planned this immediately. Nobody answered because nobody needed to. The evidence was already speaking loudly enough. Then Daniel looked directly at me. Mrs. Carter, legally speaking, you may return to the home today if you choose. The room fell silent again. Return home. Such simple words. Yet suddenly my heartbeat quickened with fear instead of relief. Because despite everything, Ryan was still inside that house. My son, the child I carried for 9 months. The boy Tom taught to shave standing beside the upstairs bathroom mirror. The same boy who now avoided my eyes while lawyers explained property violations. Daniel seemed to understand my hesitation immediately. You would not return alone, he said gently. And frankly, I believe your son may already realize how serious this situation has become. Almost as if summoned by those words, Daniel's office phone buzzed softly on the conference table. His assistant's voice came through the speaker. Mr. Mercer, Ryan Carter is here asking to see you. He says it is urgent. Nobody moved. Daniel looked toward me carefully. Would you like him sent in? I stared out the rain-covered windows for several long seconds before answering quietly. Yes. Because part of me still needed to hear my son explain how he ended up here at all. Ryan entered the conference room looking like a man who had not slept all night. His shoulders were tense beneath a wrinkled gray jacket, and his eyes immediately found mine the moment the door closed behind him. For a second, neither of us spoke. I realized then that grief had aged him too. Not as much as it aged me, but enough. He looked older than 43 suddenly. Older and frightened in a way I had never seen before. Daniel Mercer gestured calmly toward the empty chair across from me. Please sit down, Ryan. Ryan obeyed quietly. The room felt unbearably still after that. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while traffic moved far below us downtown. Ordinary life continuing while our family sat in pieces around a polished conference table. Ryan rubbed his hands together nervously before finally speaking. Mom, I did not know about the trust. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I studied him carefully. Part of me wanted to believe him immediately because mothers spend a lifetime searching for reasons to forgive their children. But another part of me remembered standing outside my own front door while he watched silently from the hallway. You still changed the locks, I said quietly. Ryan lowered his eyes. Vanessa said we needed boundaries after Dad passed. Boundaries. Such a polite word for abandonment. Daniel leaned back in his chair calmly. Mr. Carter, Your wife contracted movers and discussed listing a property your mother legally controls. That is significantly more serious than establishing boundaries. Ryan swallowed hard. I understand that now. I looked at him for a long moment before asking the question that had been sitting inside my chest for days. Why did you not stop her? Ryan's jaw tightened painfully. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then finally he looked up at me with an expression I recognized immediately. Shame. Because after Dad died, he said slowly, everything became about pressure. Richard frowned slightly beside me. Ryan continued quietly. Bills. Mortgage discussions. Vanessa talking constantly about how expensive our apartment was. She kept saying the house made more sense for our future. Future. Another innocent-sounding word capable of enormous cruelty. And your future did not include your mother living there. I asked softly. Ryan closed his eyes briefly. That is not what I wanted. But it is what happened. The silence afterward stretched painfully long. Daniel finally opened another folder in front of him. There is an additional matter we need to address. Ryan straightened slightly. Daniel slid several papers across the table. These are the moving authorizations signed electronically from your email account. Ryan stared down at them in confusion. I never signed those. Daniel's expression sharpened carefully. Then someone signed them using your credentials. Every person at the table went still. Slowly, Ryan turned toward me again. Mom, I swear to you, I did not authorize removing your furniture. For the first time since all of this began, I believed him completely. Because suddenly I saw something beneath his guilt and weakness. Confusion. Real confusion. Richard leaned forward sharply. Who had access to your email? Ryan's face paled instantly. Nobody needed to say Vanessa's name aloud. Daniel folded his hands calmly. This situation is becoming considerably more complicated. Ryan pushed both hands through his hair and stood abruptly from the chair. I need to talk to her. Daniel's voice remained steady. Before you do anything emotional, understand this clearly. If Mrs. Carter chooses, she may pursue civil action regarding unlawful lock changes, unauthorized property removal, and attempted real estate interference. Ryan looked physically ill now. I never wanted any of this. I believe that too. But wanting and allowing are not the same thing. Weakness can destroy people just as thoroughly as cruelty. I thought about Tom again then. About the sadness in his eyes during those final months. Maybe he had already realized our son confused keeping peace with doing what was right. Ryan slowly sat back down again and looked directly at me. Mom, I am sorry. Such simple words. Words I had waited days to hear. Yet somehow they did not heal anything. Because apologies arrive too late sometimes. They stand helplessly beside damage already done. Where are my things? I asked quietly. Ryan blinked in surprise at the question. A storage facility outside Reynoldsburg. Vanessa arranged it last week. Last week. Before I even left for Helen's house. They had already planned everything. Daniel made another note calmly. We will recover the property immediately. Ryan nodded weakly before looking back at me. You can come home today. Home. The word felt different now than it once did. Not warm. Not comforting. Just complicated. I looked down at my wedding ring again, twisting softly against my finger beneath the conference room lights. Tom spent 42 years building a safe life around me brick by brick. Yet it took only a few weeks after his death for everything underneath it to crack open. No, I said softly. Ryan frowned slightly. Mom, I lifted my eyes to his. I will return when the house feels like mine again. Nobody spoke after that. Because deep down, every person in that room understood exactly what I meant. The locks were never the real betrayal. It was the realization that while I was grieving my husband, someone inside that house had already started treating my life like leftover belongings waiting to be packed away. And somewhere beneath all the legal documents and moving trucks and changed curtains, the hardest truth remained painfully simple. Tom had protected me from losing the house, but he could not protect me from losing the family we built inside it. 3 days later, I stood in my kitchen again, holding a cup of coffee, while morning sunlight spread slowly across the countertops Tom installed with his own hands. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock above the stove and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Familiar sounds. Familiar light. Yet everything inside me felt different now. Returning home had not happened dramatically. There were no shouting matches. No police officers. No cruel final confrontation on the porch. Real family heartbreak rarely ends with cinematic explosions. Most of the time it ends in silence. in signatures, in exhausted people avoiding each other's eyes while lawyers finalize arrangements nobody imagined becoming necessary. Daniel Mercer handled everything quickly after the meeting downtown. The moving company returned my belongings within 48 hours after receiving formal notice from his office. Piece by piece, my life slowly came back into the house. The cedar chest returned to the foot of my bed. Tom's recliner returned beside the den window overlooking the backyard. My dishes returned to the kitchen cabinets exactly where I had always kept them. But some things never fully returned. The ease inside the house disappeared forever. Ryan moved out the same evening Daniel finalized the trust review. I did not ask where he went. Part of me assumed he stayed temporarily with friends. Another part suspected Vanessa's parents opened their home to them after everything collapsed. Either way, the upstairs bedroom sat empty now. Sometimes late at night, I still caught myself listening for footsteps overhead before remembering nobody else lived here anymore. Vanessa never contacted me directly after the attorney meetings. Not once. Daniel informed us she hired separate legal counsel after discovering the house could not legally be sold or transferred during my lifetime. The storage fees, moving contracts, and attempted listing costs became their responsibility entirely. Richard told me quietly one evening that Vanessa seemed furious Ryan never knew the full details of the trust. Apparently, she believed he had hidden information from her intentionally. But I understood the truth more clearly than anyone by then. Ryan did not lose himself because he was cruel. He lost himself because he allowed someone else to think for him until he could no longer recognize right from wrong. Weakness destroys families in quieter ways than hatred ever does. One chilly Sunday morning in November, about 6 weeks after everything happened, Ryan knocked on my front door unexpectedly. I remember freezing halfway through watering the plants in the kitchen sink because hearing that knock felt strangely unfamiliar now. Through the glass beside the door, he looked thinner than before. Tired. Alone. For several seconds I considered pretending I was not home. Then I opened the door quietly. Ryan stood there holding a small cardboard box against his chest. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded uncertain in a way I had never heard from him before. I stepped aside silently so he could enter. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon candles and furniture polish. Autumn sunlight stretched through the living room windows across hardwood floors. Tom spent months refinishing after retirement. Ryan looked around slowly as though seeing the house clearly for the first time in years. "It looks like home again," he said softly. I did not answer immediately. Because home is not just furniture returned to the right places. It is trust, safety, belonging. And some of those things have been damaged more deeply than either of us knew how to repair yet. Ryan set the cardboard box carefully on the dining room table. "I found these in our storage unit." Inside were old photo albums. My wedding pictures. Ryan's baby photos. Birthday cards Tom saved for decades in neat little bundles tied with ribbon. I touched one of the albums gently while emotion tightened unexpectedly in my chest. Vanessa was going to throw them away, Ryan admitted quietly. The room fell silent after that. Finally, Ryan pulled out a chair and sat down slowly at the table. The same table where Tom used to read newspapers every Sunday morning while teasing me about overcooking bacon. "I filed for separation last week," Ryan said. I looked up sharply. He rubbed both hands together nervously before continuing. "After everything with the house." I realized I stopped recognizing myself. There was no anger in his voice, just exhaustion. The kind that comes when illusions finally collapse. I studied my son carefully across the table. For the first time in months, he looked honest. Not confident, not defensive, just painfully honest. "Your father worried about you," I said quietly. Ryan lowered his eyes immediately. "I know that now." We sat there a long time afterward, surrounded by old photographs and memories neither of us fully knew how to carry anymore. Outside, leaves drifted slowly across the backyard Tom loved so much. Winter was coming soon. The maple tree near the fence stood nearly bare already. Grief changes shape with time. At first it feels like drowning. Then eventually it becomes something quieter. A missing voice in the next room. An empty chair at dinner. A life you still reach for sometimes before remembering it is gone. Before leaving that afternoon, Ryan paused beside the front door awkwardly. "Mom." I looked up from the photo album in my lap. His eyes filled slightly before he spoke again. "Dad was right to protect you." The words hurt and healed at the same time. After he left, I stood alone on the porch for a while, watching the sun lower slowly over the neighborhood. The air smelled cold and clean. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while riding bicycles down the sidewalk. Ordinary life continuing again. I thought about Tom then, about everything he built with his quiet hands and steady heart. The house, the family, the years. In the end, he could not stop our family from breaking apart after he was gone. But he made sure nobody could erase me from the life we created together. And standing there beneath the fading November light, one truth settled gently inside me at last. Tom built the house, but I was the one who made it a home.